I'm going to break down the entire cardiovascular system. So I'm first going to start off that saying blood leaves the heart through arteries, then it goes to the arterioles, then capillaries, then venules, then veins. The heart needs its own blood supply to the tissue to work, so it branches off of the base of the aorta into the right coronary arteries that branch off the marginal arteries and also the posterior atrioventricular artery on the back. The left coronary artery you can only see a little bit up here, but it branches off into the anterior atrioventricular artery and the circumflex artery. That's going to go around the back. Then, it goes back to the veins. So these would be the small cardiac veins paired with the marginal arteries. This would be the great cardiac vein paired with the anterior atrioventricular artery. Great cardiac vein. And in the back, with the posterior atrioventricular artery, is paired with the middle cardiac vein. And all of these veins will drain into the coronary sinus and go back into the right atrium. So how does it get to the body? Let me tell you. So from the base of the aorta goes to the ascending aorta, the transverse, and descending. Off the transverse is the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian artery. And off of the brachiocephalic trunk is going to be the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. The common carotid arteries branch off into the external carotid, and that goes up and more does the outside of the head blood supply, but then it also goes to the internal carotid artery. We see here, these would be the common carotid. Yes. And this would be the subclavian, and branching off the subclavian is what is known as the vertebral artery. And then into here. The circle of Willis is at the base of the brain, and its function is basically to make sure blood is always going to be flowing to the brain in case something goes wrong and it has backup. So these are the vertebral arteries, and they branch into basilar artery, these posterior cerebral arteries, this posterior communicating, and these eyebrows are actually the internal carotid. And this is the middle cerebral. And I'll go to the middle section of the brain. The posterior goes to the posterior part of the brain. And the anterior cerebral will go to the front of the brain. So this is technically like a part of the middle cerebral, but connecting the two anterior cerebral arteries is the anterior communicating. I spelled that wrong. This is kind of a drawn out version of how the sinuses of the brain would be. We have the superior, the inferior, the straight, the transverse, and the sigmoidal. And this will go down into the internal jugular vein, into the subclavian vein, and yeah. Arteries are deep in the body, and arteries are paired with deep veins that have adjacent names, but not only veins can be deep, they can also be superficial, and they are not necessarily paired with an artery. So they have different names. Okay, so we have the subclavian artery here, and then it will go into the axillary artery around in the armpit, the brachial artery, which will be the upper part of the arm, and it will branch off into the ulnar artery, which will be more medial, and the radial artery. Then, in the hand, there is the deep and superficial palmar arches and the digital arteries. Deep veins follow the same groove with the subclavian vein, the axillary vein, the brachial vein, and then the ulnar and radial veins. But there's more. The ones in the hand would be the same. Superficial in the arm would be the cephalic vein, basilic vein, the median antebrachial, and median cuboidal right here. Okay, let's move to the abdomen and lower body. Off of the descending aorta is the thoracic aorta, and then once it crosses the diaphragm, it turns into the abdominal aorta. So this structure is called the celiac trunk, and it branches into 3 arteries: the common hepatic artery, the left gastric artery, and the splenic artery. I'll show this on here. Where is it? This small one here would be the celiac trunk. This would be the common hepatic. This would be the splenic, and then the left gastric is also off. The right and left renal arteries go to the kidneys. The superior mesenteric goes to the small intestine, ascending colon, first 2/3 of the transverse colon, and the inferior mesenteric goes to the last 1/3 of the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. And I'll show you that this is the superior mesenteric. This would be the inferior mesenteric, and then going into the kidneys would be the renal. Up and down the abdominal aorta, we have this split right here, and it's called the common iliac arteries. This would be the pelvis region. And then the common iliac artery branches into the internal iliac artery, and right here would be the external iliac artery that continues into the femoral artery, then the popliteal artery, then this branch right here is perineal artery, and then the anterior and posterior tibial arteries to the pedal artery to the digital. So showing this on the model, this would be the common iliac, and then the internal iliac, the external iliac going to the femoral, and then it will go into the popliteal artery, then it will branch off into the anterior tibial and the posterior tibial to the pedal and to the digital. Now the veins of the abdomen and lower body. Okay, so the inferior mesenteric and gastric vein go into the splenic vein that join the hepatic portal vein, which the superior mesenteric also goes into to get filtered by the liver and then back via the hepatic vein into the inferior vena cava. That should actually be like this. Okay, then the renal veins have its own that drain into the inferior vena cava, and on here. So this would be the inferior mesenteric vein going into the splenic vein. This would obviously be the splenic vein, and I don't see where exactly the gastric is, but pretend it's also going into here. Then you see how this right here is a superior mesenteric, and it's going to join that splenic vein into the hepatic portal vein in the liver. The renal veins going straight to the inferior vena cava. It's reverse arteries, except there's an anterior and posterior tibial vein, a great saphenous vein more immediately, and after the popliteal, the small saphenous vein goes into here. And we have a superficial and deep venous arch and digital veins on the plantar side and the dorsal side. This would be the great saphenous, femoral, anterior and posterior tibial, and this would be the small one all going into the popliteal. And then femoral, external iliac, common iliac to the inferior vena cava. That was it.